Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Baker Institute. I am really particularly very happy this evening to launch this new lecture series, which is something that really was born about 2 years ago when we sat down with Professor Bill Martin here at Rice University and Harry Chavan, and we had our initial discussions about the role of religion in politics and policy. To me, this is one of the most important factors in the post-Cold War era, is what I call the underestimated role of religion and culture in policy, both domestic and foreign. And I truly believe that our policymakers, be they domestic or in the foreign policy national security scene, if they fail to bring into the equation the role of religion and culture, we will be not up to the great challenge of the 21st century in defining and formulating the public policies that need to be formulated in facing contemporary and future challenges. I want to thank Harry Chavan and Harry for really instituting and establishing the Harry and Hazel Chavan Lecture Series on religion and American public policy. And this is the inaugural presentations in this lecture series. You will see in the sheet that is in your program that we have a program outlined for the whole of this year, throughout this year. Tonight's program, of course, is Reflections on the Elections, the Role of Religion in the 2000 elections, a very pertinent issue. A second conference on religion in the political realm, what is its appropriate role, will be held in March. And you can see from the sheet the prominent individuals that will be partaking in those panel discussions. And again, we're not bragging, but I think we've been a little prescient here. If you look at the third conference, faith-based organizations and the provision of social services, you see that we hit a long time before it became popular last week. We hit on one of the major political issues that is current in the American political scene, that of the role of faith-based organizations. And I remember those initial discussions when this was just, we were even debating, well, should we really do this? Do you think it'll be pertinent? And additional conferences are slated for the fall of 2001, and as you can see, the topics to discuss will include the interplay between religion and key social issues as education and cultural conflict, and the political impact of religion around the globe. We'll be looking into world religions such as Islam and the political dynamics within various parts of the world and world religions. So we're very excited about this lecture series. I think it brings out the best of what we have here at Rice and our faculty, bringing together experts, as you'll see at the panel. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Bill Martin, who is really the brains behind this whole initiative. Professor Martin is the Harry and Hazel Chavan Professor of Religion and Public Policy in the Department of Sociology at Rice University and a senior scholar in the James A. Baker Institute for Public Policy. He is the author of With God on Our Side, The Rise of the Religious Right in America, which was a companion book to the 1996 PBS miniseries of the same name, and he has written recently on the influence of religion on American foreign policy. In fact, his article was the cover article of Foreign Policy magazine. So I'm very proud to introduce to the audience here Professor Bill Martin, who will introduce our distinguished panelists. Bill?
Thank you, and let me say how truly delighted I am to see such a good audience here this evening. I also want to reemphasize and second what Ambassador Jurigian has said about how much Harry and Hazel Chavan have meant to Rice as a former trustee, have played a major role in building a strong religious studies department, and now has taken an active role in making sure that religion is given a full full hearing and full consideration in the Baker Institute. And it also makes me, gives me enormous honor and privilege to be the Siobhan Professor of Religion and Public Policy. I'm going to introduce all of the speakers in now and let them just follow in course rather than stand up and introduce them intermittently. After they have finished, we'll talk a while and then have questions from the audience. Our first speaker is James Reichley, who describes his career as checkered. I would call it multifaceted and illustrious. He has been political editor of Fortune magazine, a member of the White House staff under President Ford, senior fellow for 15 years at the Brookings Institution, and senior fellow for the last 8 years at the Graduate Public Policy Institute of Georgetown. He is the author of, among others, Conservatives in an Age of Change, Religion in American Public Life, The Life of the Parties, and coming out in April, The Values Connection. John Green is professor of political science and director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. He has done extensive research on religion and politics, especially on the Christian right. And he is co-author of The Diminishing Divide, Religion's Changing Role in American Politics, and The Bully Pulpit, The Politics of Protestant Clergy. He was also a key consultant for the PBS miniseries With God on Our Side. He's frequently heard on All Things Considered and other NPR programs. Clyde Wilcox is a professor of government at Georgetown University. He writes on religion and politics, gender politics, campaign finances, and other topics. And he's the author or co-author of at least 11 books and monographs, including God's Warriors, The Christian Right in 20th Century America and Onward, Christian Soldiers, The Christian Right in American Politics, as well as a host of articles and chapters and books. Professor Reichley is going to talk about more mainline Protestants and Roman Catholics and some other things having to do with the election. John Green and Clyde Wilcox are going to talk about particularly emphasizing the religious right, with John talking about the role the religious right played in the elections, and Clyde Wilcox addressing more the question of what will be the future, what appears to be the future of the religious right. Bob Stein is the Lena Goldman Fox Professor of Political Science and the beloved, not to say too much, revered Dean of the School of Social Sciences here at Rice, and my Dean, and is the author of three books and many articles dealing with federalism, intergovernmental relations, government spending, and other aspects of public policy. And of course, he's known to most Houstonians for his prominent role as a television, radio, and print media analyst on elections at every level. And my own work on political matters has focused mainly on the Christian right, but in the last year or so has included an interest in the growing efforts of Muslims to play a role in American politics, and I'll be talking a bit about that. We hope you have an instructive and enjoyable evening. And now I'll invite Professor Reichley.
Thank you, Bill. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all this evening. John Green gets us from time to time to come to the Ray Bliss Institute that he runs in Akron, Ohio. It's always customary for those of us who knew Ray Bliss, the great Ohio Republican chairman and later national Republican chairman in the 1960s, and to pay tribute to Ray Bliss. And there's always some spoilsport then who says, "I never knew Ray Bliss." It's, sort of puts us under a cloud. But it's a particular pleasure for me tonight to be speaking at the James Baker Institute, because I knew Jim Baker and know Jim Baker even better. As Bill indicated, we were comrades in arms in the Ford administration in 1976 and fought together in the second closest election, the presidential election of the last 100 years, and with a few thousand more votes in Ohio and Hawaii, Gerald Ford would have continued to be president. But this year, a few months ago, Jim carried on without me and predictably had a more positive result, as you have all observed. Well, Bill has asked us to talk tonight and to discuss the role of religion in the 2000 election. From time to time during the campaign, there was a great deal of focus by the press and somewhat less by the public on religious issues when people like John and Clyde and sometimes myself would get press calls and be invited to appear on television and radio programs. Then it would subside again. But I would argue that at a deeper level, religion played a very major role in deciding the entire outcome of the election. Religion has always played an important part in American politics, has helped determine who belonged to which party, and sometimes has been a major issue in campaigns going all the way back to 1796, when the conservative Congregationalists and Presbyterians denounced the alleged atheism of Thomas Jefferson, while the evangelical Baptists and Methodists rallied around Jefferson and supported his equalitarianism and insistence on separation between church and state. In the early part of the 19th century, divisions over slavery led to splits of several major Protestant denominations into southern and northern churches, some of which continue to this day. After the Civil War, most northern Protestants became reliably Republican, while Southern Protestants and Catholics were overwhelmingly Democratic, a division which continued to have force at least until the 1970s, and in some place it does even today. Early in the 20th century, some Protestants in the social gospel movement followed Theodore Roosevelt into the Progressive Party, and later many of them became Democrats under Woodrow Wilson. Catholicism was an issue in Al Smith's campaign for president in 1928 and in John Kennedy's successful campaign in 1960. In the 1960s, the civil rights struggle, Protestants, Catholics, and Jewish groups played a major role in enactment in the civil rights laws of that time. Lyndon Johnson said they could not have been passed without the support they received from the religious community. More recently, the emergence of the religious right, which Clyde and John are experts on, in the latter part of the 1970s and the 1980s, really, if not transformed, altered American politics in a very fundamental way, moving most evangelicals who had historically been Democrats over onto the Republican and conservative side. Catholics at the same time were shifting from their traditional alignment with the Democratic Party, though not in as spectacular a fashion. There was reaction against this. The unpopularity of the religious right caused some middle-class Republicans to shift over, and at least in some elections, to vote for Democratic candidates. This was the backdrop in which the 2000 campaign began. The Republican strategists had recognized that they needed the evangelicals to form part of their coalition in order to win a national election, but recognized that the too close identification with the religious right was costing them votes among middle-class voters in the suburbs. Democrats, on the other hand, were very pleased to be identified as opponents of religious bigotry, but did not wish to be identified as indifferent or certainly hostile to religion as such. As the campaign began in 1999, both parties indicated that they were going to try to appear to be religion friendly. One key aide for Vice President Gore said, this time the Democrats are going to take God back. Vice President Gore himself said that faith-based organizations would have a seat at the table if he should be elected president. The first big eruption of religion into the campaign, however, came in December of '99 in a debate between the Republican candidates in New Hampshire, in which the moderator asked each of them to name a favorite political philosopher, and George W. Bush said Christ, because he changed my heart. The moderator asked him to explain that further, and he said, if they don't know, it will be hard to explain. Bush was criticized for that. It was some of the secular press and strict separationists said it was really inappropriate for him to introduce religion that explicitly into his campaign. Then things fell back for a while until after Bush had lost to John McCain in the New Hampshire primary and faced McCain in the critical South Carolina primary and went to begin his campaign at Bob Jones University, was embraced by Bob Jones III, and won that primary decisively against McCain. Facing annihilation in the forthcoming Michigan primary, McCain then turned his guns on the fact that Bob Jones University, whether or not Bush had known it, was identified with a very strong anti-Catholic rhetoric, and McCain launched a campaign in Michigan of phone calls to Catholics indicating that Bush was anti-Catholic. McCain won, but then in the Super Tuesday that followed, Bush won a great sweep of states. McCain actually never won a majority of the Republican vote in any primary. Bush, of course, went on to be nominated. Vice President Gore then selected Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut as his vice presidential running mate, who was the first Jew to be included on a major party slate in a presidential election. And it was regarded as a great breakthrough for inclusion, but it turned out that Lieberman was perhaps a little more inclusive than Gore had expected, because he was very critical of the strict separation view in separation between church and state. He said that the Constitution protects us for freedom of religion, not freedom from religion, which raised the ire of some of the civil rights groups. Religion then came back from time to time. Lieberman stuck to his guns on religion while changing his views on many other issues. But while at the grassroots, some of the religious organizations were very active, it became less of a salient issue. The election, as we know, ended in a virtual tie for president, for the House of Representatives, and for the Senate. But it was not, that division was not even across the country. The Gore, in a map, the Gore red was heavily concentrated in the Northeast, along the West Coast, and then in a few islands across the country. The rest of the country was a sea of Bush blue, leading some political scientists and some journalists and other commentators to say that we essentially have two nations, one a religious nation, and the other unreligious or anti-religious or indifferent to religion. Well, the first thing to observe, I think, in considering that suggestion is that there are a very large number of religious people and some important religious groups that are on the Democratic side of the divide. The most important being the African American church. African Americans have always been more organized through their churches than any other group, and have remained very heavily on the Democratic side, actually going more heavily for Gore in 2000 than they had for Bill Clinton 4 years before, giving about 90%, a little more than 90% of their vote to Gore. Jewish voters also continued to remain strongly on the Democratic side. Bob Stein, I think, is going to talk to us a little more about that later. About 80% of Jews now normally vote Democratic. Bush did a little bit better than Bob Dole had done in 1996, but was not really able to crack that group very much. He did somewhat better among Hispanic Americans, about two-thirds of whom are Catholics, going from Dole got only about 20%, Bush got about 30% of the Hispanic vote, did much better than that in Texas, did much better than that in Florida, but still remained have a minority attraction among Hispanics. Hispanics tend to be socially conservative, and Republicans have hoped to bring them in on that identification. They pretty much have given up, at least until very recently, on African Americans. But many Hispanics suspect, particularly in California, suspect the Republicans of being hostile to immigrants and, by extension, to Hispanics in general. Non-Hispanic Catholics, by most measures, voted by a small majority for Bush this year, and I'll say more about that in a moment. Mainline Protestants, who have historically been heavily Republican, the Protestant denominations at their national levels shifted after the 1960s to being extremely liberal, attacking the Reagan and Bush administrations across the board for a number of reasons, making that shift. But Protestants out in the pews in both the North and more recently in the South have remained pretty much Republican. A study by the Presbyterian Church last year found, for instance, that 55% of Presbyterians regard themselves as Republicans, 25% as Democrats, and 17% as independents. Mainline Protestants voted by about 60% for George Bush. Gore's largest single body of support actually came from the growing body of seculars and the group that John Green calls nominally religious, who together make almost 30% of the population. Voters who say they never go to church, 61% voted for Gore, 32% for Bush. At the other side of the scale, people who say they participate in religious services at least once a week voted 58% for Bush and 40% for Gore. So it would certainly seem that religious identification and commitment had an effect on voting. Among non-Hispanic Catholics, the institutional Catholic Church has continued to give mixed signals in politics on economic issues, in their communitarian tradition, often favoring federal government intervention of the kind that is supported by liberal Democrats. But on the abortion issue, which increasingly is the focus of the Catholic Church in elections, the Catholic Church is much, the Republican Party is much more in line with the Catholic position than the Democratic Party is. I think abortion has gone beyond with Catholics, those Catholics, a minority of Catholics actually, who vote on that issue. Catholics who used to, 20 or 30 years ago, most Catholics felt if you were a good Catholic, you really should be a Democrat. Catholics today are recognizing that their church and the Democratic Party are diametrically opposed on what both regard as an important issue, now feel perfectly free to vote Republican, and those who are economically conservative are increasingly doing so in this election, giving a slight majority of their vote by most measures to Bush. Mainline Protestants, many voted for Bush out of inherited party tradition. Many voted for Bush out of what they regarded as their economic interest. But I think there was more to it than that, and also for many Catholics as well. The great puzzle of the 2000 election, of course, is why Gore didn't win easily. With a booming economy over a number of years, relative peace in the world, it would seem that the party, the candidate of the incumbent party should win. At the American Political Science Convention in Washington last September, which most of us attended, most of us up here attended, a panel of experts all predicted that Gore would win by a landslide on the basis of their models. And they said that there was less than a 10% chance that Bush could actually win the election. Why were they so wrong? Well, their models were based, most of them, on the economy and on job approval of the incumbent president. What, of course, they did not take into consideration was the approval of the president as a human being. And among voters, and 60% of all voters told the exit pollsters that they viewed Clinton unfavorably as a person, and that included many who gave him a high approval rating for his performance as president. Among that 60%, 70% voted for Bush. I think that the rejection of Vice President Gore, who identified as the candidate associated with President Bush, was based on the belief of many voters that President Clinton and the Clinton White House in general had violated ethical and moral norms, which I argue in my book that comes out in the spring, have been based very largely on the Judeo-Christian moral tradition. That the disapproval of Bush played into a sense of moral discomfort that many Americans feel, even in a time of economic plenty. 50% of the voters told the exit pollsters that they thought the moral climate of the country was on the wrong track. 62% of those voted for Bush. So I think that this was really the source of Gore's surprising defeat in terms of past history. And since the values on which Gore, as a stand-in, a representative figure for Clinton, was rejected, came from a religious tradition, it seems to me that this by far was the most important religious factor in the 2000 election. Thank you.
It's really a great honor to be here at the Baker Institute this evening, and it's a particular honor to be on this panel with my distinguished colleagues. On my way out on the airplane, I was proofreading a chapter that some of my colleagues and I have co-authored, and I just for fun, I thought I would count up the number of references to the gentlemen on this panel, and it was truly extraordinary. In fact, I felt like I should maybe give them co-authorship on the paper because we quoted their work so much. So it really is a great pleasure to be with you all here this evening. I would like to talk a little bit this evening about the role of the religious right or the Christian right and the various constituencies that they claim to represent and attempt to mobilize. And to do that, I'd like to make reference to a statistical table which is being passed out. I don't mean to numb you with numbers, but I think it's interesting and will help us understand a little bit better the remarks I'm going to make. But before we get there, let me just talk a little bit about the religious right in general and some of the expectations going into the 2000 election. As Jim Reichley so ably pointed out, religion played an extraordinary and unusual role in the 2000 campaign. Religion's always been a very important part of American politics, sometimes more important than others, but in this particular campaign, it was figured very, very prominently. In fact, it seems to me that the prominence of religion may help explain the closeness of the results. Jim indicated many of the examples that I was going to give of how religion was prominent in the political debate. But you know, there was one voice that seemed to be largely absent in this campaign, and that was the voice of the Christian right. If the past had been any guide, we would have expected Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and their associates to be playing an extraordinary role, particularly given all the other comments about religion. They hardly seem able to keep their mouths shut on this particular subject, and yet we hardly heard from them at all. And this led many journalists and other observers to conclude that the Christian right had lost its bite, that the voters that they represented were being moved by other issues, that their organizations were weak, and that they were very unlikely to play an important role in this campaign. And there was a lot of other evidence to support that. As many of you know, I'm sure, the Christian Coalition and some of the other organizations of the Christian right have had their troubles, to put it mildly. There was also a feeling that it would be very difficult for a moderate Republican, such as George W. Bush, to be able to mobilize these groups, even if the Christian right organizations were able, well-organized, and capable of influencing the vote. There was a real feeling that he would have difficulties with that. And of course, the primary season began with a sense that he was going to have particular trouble because there were several of his rivals that were trying very hard to appeal to those voters. Well, as it turned out, the election turned out a good bit different than expectations, as often happens. I guess that's why we have elections. But if we could just turn to the table, let me explain a little bit about it, and we'll look at how some of the key voting blocks voted. This is the result of a survey that was conducted at the University of Akron before and after the fall election. It's a third in a series of surveys on religion and politics funded by the Pew Charitable Trust. And one of the things we do in these surveys is we try to measure religious affiliation and other religious characteristics with a great deal of precision. And this allows us to say some things about religious groups and their voting behavior that other surveys can't do, simply because they don't have the resources to look at religion in the kind of detail that we do. Down the side of the table are the major religious voting blocks. At the top are evangelical Protestants. These are white evangelicals. Then mainline Protestants, the group that Jim just alluded to, white Roman Catholics, black Protestants. These are not all African Americans, but African Americans in the historic black Protestant churches. We combined all of the Hispanics together because they're not, even in a large sample, they're not enough to break them up into their different groups. And then unfortunately we had to combine all the other faiths, which is a rather large group running from Mormons to Muslims. And I'll be happy to comment on the details of that group if that comes to that. And then finally the seculars at the bottom of the page, a group of people who are not identified with organized religion, although many of them have spiritual values. They're not entirely a-religious, but certainly not connected with organized religion. In the larger groups, we divided them up according to religious observance. So we have the observant and the less observant. And the way that was defined was by church attendance. Individuals who claimed to attend church once a week or more were classified as observant, and those who claimed to attend less than once a week as less observant. So even the less observant, many of them apparently occasionally went to church. Although there is some dispute, as I'm sure some of you know, in the polling industry as to how seriously one can take reports of church attendance. In any event, I think these numbers show some interesting things. First of all, at the very top of the page, observant white evangelical Protestants, the core constituency of the religious right, voted very strongly for Bush. In our numbers, 84% for Bush and 16% for Gore. This is a marked increase over how they voted in 1996, when a little over 70% voted for Bob Dole. Notice that the less observant were less Republican, and this is a pattern that we see throughout the data, and it's actually a long-standing pattern in the 1990s. Mainline Protestants, the observant, also voted strongly for Bush. The less observant, less so. Notice the Roman Catholic community was very sharply divided, with the observant white Catholics voting on balance for Bush and the less observant voting on balance for Gore. And then we come to black Protestants. There actually are a few Republican votes in the black Protestant community, but not very many. But notice that church attendance doesn't seem to make very much difference. The observant voted 97% for Gore and the less observant 95% for Gore. I guess we'd have to say that this group was solidly Democratic. Democrats also did very well among Hispanic Christians, although as Jim indicated, if you break Hispanics up, Republicans did much better among Hispanic Protestants. And the secular community voted heavily for Gore. All the other faiths combined, on balance, also voted for Gore. But of course, there are a lot of different groups in there. For instance, the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, that voted very heavily for Bush. In fact, In many surveys, they are the most Republican religious group in the country. Then, of course, there's the Jewish community, which voted very heavily for Gore. Well, the observant categories that we're looking at here, observant evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, and Roman Catholics, have all been targets at one time or another of the Christian right. Observant evangelicals being the prime target, since almost all of the leaders of the religious right are evangelical Protestants themselves. But in recent times, they have branched out their appeals to include observant mainline Protestants, and they've attempted to reach into the Roman Catholic community with somewhat less success, at least at an organizational level. They tried for a very long time to reach into the African American community. Many African American Protestants are very religious and theologically are very much on the same wavelength as many of their white counterparts, but that has been a resounding failure. So in a sense, the expectations coming into the election were not met. The prime constituency of the religious right voted very heavily for Bush, and some of the other constituencies that the religious right has sought to target also voted heavily for Bush, although not as strongly. Turnout is an important part of this. In our data, it seems that white Protestants as a group actually turned out at a slightly lower rate than they did in 1996. This may be in part because many of the states where white Protestants are common were not competitive in this election. There's a lot of excitement about the presidential election in Alabama, unfortunately. There's a lot of excitement in Ohio and in some other states, Florida, but not in much of the South and the West. On the other hand, black Protestants turned out in very, very high numbers. In fact, some people would argue that in some areas they broke records. So this large margin for Gore among the black Protestant church was magnified by very heavy turnout. Also very heavy turnout among Hispanics in some parts of the country. In fact, if you look at these numbers carefully, one can conclude that both parties had a strong religious basis for their coalition. The Republican coalition, Bush's ballots, came basically from observant Christians, white Christians, and less observant Protestants, and then a handful of some other people thrown in there as well. On the other hand, the Democratic coalition, Gore's ballots, came heavily from African American Protestants, secular Americans, less observant Catholics, and then generally less observant Christians, and people outside of the Christian faiths, or outside of the main Christian faiths in any event, particularly from the Jewish community. So each of these candidates can claim to have a religious coalition, but they're very different religious coalitions. I think both candidates deserve some credit for putting together these disparate groups very successfully in the campaign, but both of them built very narrow coalitions. As we know, as Jim mentioned, the election was essentially a tie in the popular vote, with Vice President Gore actually winning the popular vote by about 500,000 ballots. But nonetheless, both of those coalitions were quite narrow, and both of them had some difficulty, I think, in appealing to groups that are not normally associated with their party. In fact, both candidates had major failures on the religious front. The fact that George Bush was unable to do better among African Americans and Hispanics, groups that he targeted very heavily during the campaign, I think must be a great disappointment to the Republican Party. On the other hand, the fact that Al Gore lost all of the white Protestant vote, all of those groups, to Bush must be a great disappointment to him, particularly since, of course, Al Gore is a white Protestant, in fact, an evangelical. And one could argue, in fact, that one of the things that was crucial in the results of the election was the inability of Gore to hang on to the less observant evangelical and mainline Protestants. Our survey in 1996 suggested that Clinton and Gore broke even with Bob Dole in these groups. And there are other surveys that suggest that the Democrats actually carried those groups. In certain critical states such as Tennessee, West Virginia, and Arkansas, the defection of this voting bloc to the Republican ticket was probably very important in the Republicans carrying those states. So it looks like the religious right, narrowly defined and perhaps more broadly defined to include observant white Christians, did play a very important role in this very close election. Now, but did the Christian right, as a set of organizations and leaders, have much to do with this? Well, there's a couple of ways to get at that. One is to look at the contacts that these voters reported from religious groups and from their own clergy and from the members of their own congregations. As you, I'm sure, know, the Christian right has specialized in mobilizing voters through churches, through various mechanisms, perhaps the favorite tactic being the passing out of voter guides. Well, we have measures in our survey of these kinds of contacts, and the level of contacting was down from 1996 to 2000. It was not down dramatically, but it was down. And if we take all of the different forms of contacting and add it up, about 57% of the observant white evangelicals reported being contacted in some way by a source that might be attributed to the Christian right. And if we add to that contacts within their own congregation, people admitting that or telling us that people in their own congregation talked to them about the way to vote, then the number rises to 72%. Now that's actually lower than we saw in 1996. By way of comparison, of course the black Protestant church is famous for its political mobilization. By narrower measure, 69% of black Protestants reported some kind of contact, and by the broader measure, including members of their congregation, it was 78%. What happens in black Protestant churches is, in a sense, the gold standard of religious contacting. The Christian right didn't quite meet that standard, although in some respects they came close. So one can make the case that despite their weaknesses and their problems, Christian right organizations had some kind of impact via contacting. Of course, this was a very close election. They didn't need to move very many people to make a big difference. And in fact, if one looks at a broader set of indicators, partisanship, ideology, issue priorities, and so forth, the Christian right mostly preached to the converted. They mostly moved Republicans, conservatives who were concerned with moral issues, not just in the narrow sense of topics such as abortion, but in broader sense of things such as presidential scandals. Essentially, the Christian right moved those people to vote, people who might have voted anyway and might have voted Republican anyway. So despite the evidence of successful contacting, it may be that many of these people were going to vote a Republican anyway. And if you look over on the other side, many of the groups that voted for Vice President Gore, perhaps by the same measures, were likely to vote Democratic in any event. What does this tell us about the expectations regarding the Christian right and its alleged lack of influence? Well, it could be, of course, that observers were simply wrong. We've been wrong about the Christian right before. In fact, if you were to go back and look at journalistic accounts of this movement, it's been declared dead and buried numerous times, and it always seems to resurrect itself right on cue. It could also be, of course, that many of the leaders and activists in the Christian right were unusually pragmatic this year and clever, and they even prevailed upon Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell to remain silent during the campaign, which was an extraordinary feat. It could be that there were other organizations active and involved. In fact, one of the communities that reports the most contacting is not black or white Protestants, but Roman Catholics, particularly observant Roman Catholics. I doubt very much if Christian right organizations, narrowly defined, had much to do with that. But there are, of course, other organizations, like the Right to Life committees, that work very hard to mobilize observant Catholics. But there's yet another possibility that may be the more important one. It may be that Governor Bush was able to appeal to the activists associated with the Christian right and to the voters on his own terms, because of his own personal faith and because of the policy stances that he took. And by the same token, we might argue that Vice President Gore was able to appeal to his religious constituencies in the Democratic Party in very much the same way. These data do suggest, however, that the unusual level of religious discourse in the campaign may have had the effect of mobilizing and polarizing these religious groups between the two candidates. In that sense, religion had a profound effect on the campaign and is likely to for years to come. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to be here this evening, but it's never really too much fun to follow John Green because he knows more about the Christian right than almost anyone in America, and he runs this survey lab and gets all these great numbers, and so I always learn more from listening to him than anything I could possibly ever say afterwards. When John and I talked, we decided to divide up the discussion of the Christian right this way. He's talking about voting patterns, and I'm really talking about what the groups did, what the organizations were up to, and maybe what this means for the future. When I was in graduate school, we did a lot of reading about something called the critical elections. And these were elections that were going to realign the country maybe someday. And of course, they never really quite happened in the way they predicted. But in some ways, I think it's possible to imagine that the 2000 election might have been a very critical one for the Christian right. Going into this race, the movement was clearly struggling. They delivered the nomination to George Bush, as I'm going to explain in a minute, and you could make the case that they were very critical in the general election also. Of course, in an election this close, any group of 500 people delivered the election to George Bush. The early indications are that Bush understands this. He's been very careful in stroking this constituency with appointments and policy announcements and so forth, and so it's my thought that if he plays this right, he could really lock the Christian right up and get them into a pretty excited stage for him. Let me set the stage for this election. John kind of alluded to this. In 1998, all the experts were saying the Christian right was really on its way down again. They've said this many times. One of the reasons they thought this was because the Christian coalition had really organizationally collapsed. And that surprised everyone, honestly, how quickly it had happened, because we'd all been writing about what a great structure it had, and it was organized down to the county level. And then suddenly, in a period of about 2 years, I couldn't find an active county organization anywhere in Virginia. And in one period of about 6 months, they went through three state chairs. And none of the state chairs had any idea what the previous state chair had been up to. Now, how could something like that happen so quickly? Well, we were all surprised by it. Obviously, Ralph Reed was a little bit more of an important player in that organization than we thought. We always knew he was important. The two people that replaced him, Randy Tate, didn't work out very well. Robertson got the clashing with Hodel and so forth. But I think the real key was that in 1998, Pat Robertson made a couple of really important announcements on television, kind of surprising his supporters. One was that we really couldn't ban abortions and it was time to quit trying and maybe just to work on parental notification or whatever. And then the other one, which caught his activists totally off guard, was let's quit trying to impeach the president. And when he made that speech, his people were all out there trying to impeach the president sort of at his bidding, and suddenly they hear on television that he says it's not worth it anymore, and he didn't even call them first. And at that point, there were just an awful lot of state chapters that went belly up. In addition to the Christian coalition being in trouble, there were some internal debates that were heating up within the movement. There's been a long-standing debate in this movement, as there have been in others, between the purists, who think we should never compromise and only back candidates who, are perfectly acceptable on the issues, and the pragmatists. And the Christian coalition was the leading pragmatist organization. So if it was falling apart, then the purists were gaining strength. Focus on the family was moving to fill that void. And there was another debate, which we talked about a little bit at dinner, that was beginning to take effect, at least in Virginia. Cal Thomas had been an activist in the moral majority, had written a book, Blinded by Might, where he said, look, we've been at this for 20 years, and what really have we gotten from all this electoral activity we've done? What have the Republicans really given us? And a number of other leaders were saying this as well. Well, other parts of the Republican constituency get policy, and what we get is symbols and promises and so forth. And so these debates were beginning to shake, I think, the confidence of the movement. And so going into this, the prognosis was not good. And in a relatively short time, the Christian right leaders united behind a very pragmatic bandwagon of George W. Bush, and they carried him across the top in the primaries. And how could that possibly have happened? It's pretty odd, really, for a social movement or a set of interest groups to really get all behind one candidate in the primaries. You can think of Labor behind Mondale, but it's really hard to think of other examples. I think there are several reasons to this, and Jim alluded to some of them. I think most evangelicals thought that Clinton was a morally disaster for the country, and they just really thought that it was very important to get someone in the presidency who would be what they would think of as a godly man, someone who would hold up Christ. Many of them will say, if you talk to them very long, that God judges nations by the actions of their leaders. And so they thought that, even if it wasn't a perfect candidate, boy, was it really important to get someone who would be better. Secondly, many of them again and again saw Bill Clinton beat them. They didn't quite ever know why, but they really understood that maybe if they could get a presidency, then they could start to get some policy successes. And this was really stoked by the Republican leaders in Congress, who kept telling them, well, we'd push for this for you, but we really can't, because we know Clinton will veto it. And so if only we have a Republican president, then we'll promise to push for this. And some of those promises are about ready to come due, I think. And the third thing, which John alluded to also, is that George Bush did a lot of groundwork. And some of the groundwork he did was this personal testimony he has about religion. I talked to Michael Ferris a couple days ago as I was preparing this paper. Michael Ferris is a Christian right leader in Virginia. And Michael told me that essentially Bush came to meet him one-on-one, and the first thing they did in this meeting was that Bush delivered his personal religious testimony of his born-again experience and how that had changed his life. In the evangelical community, as you probably all know, that's a very powerful source of religious understanding, and Bush apparently delivered it very convincingly. And then, as he met with these leaders, he carefully signaled policy changes. He really didn't say, for example, that abortion would be a litmus test, but then he would say immediately after that, I will appoint strict constructionists, and I don't think Roe was strict construction. Talked about faith-based welfare and vouchers and so forth, and so he was really talking about the policy. So it was really unexpected, I think, that someone like George W. Bush would have been the Christian right candidate, but I think that this was part of it, was his own groundwork. And then part of it, of course, was he seemed invincible, right? He had all the money, $90 million, he had all the endorsements, and so getting behind his bandwagon would give them a chance to have access to the administration. Now, he wasn't their first choice. John Ashcroft was. He thought about running for a while and then withdrew when it looked like he might have trouble for his Senate race. There were some other people that you would imagine they would have gotten behind. Gary Bauer, who had been an activist in the organizations and head of the Family Research Council. Bauer had feuded with Robertson, so Robertson obviously wasn't going to be behind him. There was something going on with him and Dobson, too. I don't know what that was. And I think that Bauer just really lacked the stature when he went out on the stump and the voice and the presence to really convince people he could win. And Alan Keyes was certainly a favorite. Every now and then at political science meetings, you hear someone give a paper about how the Christian right's racist. And all you have to do to know that's not true is go to a Christian Coalition meeting and watch the response to Alan Keyes. The place just goes wild. He is a very engaging speaker. He's a wonderful debater, and he just gets an enthusiastic response. But of course, he had no chance of winning. And the other candidates, Forbes and Buchanan and Quayle, all had their own problems. So Robertson was behind Bush very early on. By January, he was on radio talking about how he's behind Bush. It was a very pragmatic decision. He'd tell people, well, look, I think he can win. I think he's going to be better than the Democrats. Ralph Reed signed on as a consultant, and Dobson was willing to be silent. And so suddenly the movement's entirely behind Bush at the activist level. And then McCain wins in New Hampshire, and suddenly they've got to do something about this because McCain would seem to have some attraction to evangelicals. After all, he has the military background, and he has strong pro-life credentials and so forth. And so in South Carolina, the Christian right was probably its most active in this election. They did tons of mailings. They did voter guides, more than they did in any other state. Some of the mailings had 10 facts about McCain, and best I can tell, most of them are not anywhere close to being factual. Robertson had something which was very unusual for him, and that is he'd recorded a message which they essentially had with a computerized phone calls and would play to registered Republican voters, persuading them to vote against McCain. Right-to-life groups were also active. One of their mailings had a picture of a baby and said, this little fellow wants you to vote for George W. Bush. And so in South Carolina, Bush did carry the state, but he carried the Christian right vote 68-24, and he lost the rest of the vote 52-46. And so the critical state for him, he was pretty much finished if he lost South Carolina. The Christian right carried it for him. And soon after that, of course, as Jim had said, they got into a feud with McCain attacking the Christian right, essentially, and Robertson and Falwell then were after him. But in every state, essentially, that you look at the exit polls, Bush wins the Christian right vote overwhelmingly, and other voters, including Democrats and independents, but in some states they didn't have crossover voters, McCain would win. So what's the lesson from this primary? Well, in the year 2000, the purists became pragmatic. Now, why that happened is, up for grabs, but I think most of it was Bill Clinton. Essentially, they thought that Clinton's moral bankruptcy, as they saw it, created the essential need to replace him with someone that would be closer to them. That gave Bush the chance to say, because I'm born again, I am one of you, and they gave him a little leeway not to necessarily take their positions on the issues. The second lesson I get is the Christian right doesn't need a Christian coalition infrastructure to be effective in primary elections. Essentially, all you really need now with the new election laws are some computers and some mails and some phone banks and so forth, and you can spend that money without having the volunteers, and the Christian right has the money, and so they may not need that organization anymore. And then finally, the Christian right can certainly be kingmakers in primaries at the presidential level. And here I have a table which have you passed this out at this point, or have they seen this? Okay, well, just take a look at this. You probably all had a chance to glance at it already. This is the percentage of voters in the Republican primaries who said they were members of the religious right. Now, what members means is not quite clear here. I mean, obviously, this is way too many people to be card-carrying members or dues-paying members. Even the Christian Coalition wouldn't claim that many. But they're big numbers in almost every state, even the northern states, and a third to 40% in most of the South. And so clearly, in the primaries, the Christian right can be active. Now, in the general election, Bush steered to the center, and as John said, Robertson was quiet, and everyone was just doing quiet mailing stuff. And what's really striking there is that the liberal groups were on the air all the time. NARAL and Planned Parenthood had issue ads constantly. And I think the Christian right has really decided that the more visible they are in a general election, the worse it is for their candidates. They think that it creates a backlash, that the opposition mobilizes, and so in a general election, quiet stuff, voter guides and so forth. One of the things that surprised me in Virginia, though, was that they were able to pass out voter guides at all. Now, the Christian Coalition claims to have passed out 70 million. Those numbers are always way inflated. But they did pass them out in Northern Virginia, and the best I can tell, they did not have an active chapter anywhere in Northern Virginia. Which again tells me you don't necessarily need the infrastructure. You have 15 people with cars who are willing to pass these things out and take them from church to church, and pretty much that's what you need. In the general election, the percentage of voters who identified as members of the religious right was lower. This fits with what John's saying. It went down 3% from 17 to 14, but it was a very loyal group. I'm guessing that this might imply that some of this debate about are campaigns useful or not, is beginning to have a little bit of an impact, but then it depends on what Bush does as president. Okay, one final point about what they did in the election. There was a lot more PAC activity, political action committees. Bauer had a big PAC which raised $2.7 million. Almost all of that was spent on his own presidential race. He gave about $30,000 in contributions. A couple of interesting groups, though. One of them, the Susan B. Anthony list, which is the Emily's list now of the Christian right. They're out recruiting pro-life women Christian right candidates, bundling money for them, earmarking money for them, and so forth. There was actually quite a bit of PAC activity. Okay, so where do the groups go from here? Well, it seems to me at this point that Bush is giving the Christian right some personnel and some policy payoffs, and given the Clinton context, that's probably going to be enough for them. More important for many of them is he's publicly expressing his faith again and again. He's sort of, testifying to his faith. The Ashcroft appointment was critical to them. Almost everyone in the Christian right knew this the day of the election, as soon as Ashcroft lost, they knew he was going to be the nominee, although the papers all say otherwise. But Tommy Thompson's also pretty critical to them, and a number of people are being considered beneath that. But some of the policies coming up are going to make the difference here, it seems to me. RU 486, what Bush does about that is going to be pretty important, what some of the appointments are. But we could end up looking back on this election as being a critical election for the Christian right, an election which took them from internal debate and dissension and crumbling infrastructure to a renewed understanding of why elections are important and what actually can be gained when you actually win an election.
I feel somewhat like an interloper here, or a wandering Jew, which is what I am. I'm neither Texan nor am I familiar with the Christian right, but I wanted to pose a slightly different question for consideration, and at the heart of what at least John and Clyde, I think, have raised is religion matters, and that's not altogether clear. I guess the question that I pose, and I'll talk about some research that I did with some of my colleagues here at U of H, is how influential religion is and religious affiliation to political behavior. It may very well be that this is just a spurious relationship. That is to say that there are other factors that dominate religion and are correlated to religious preferences, whether it's Baptist, Jewish, Catholic, Muslim, and that these are well known to social scientists, whether they be class, income, or ideological preferences. And the question, of course, raises what's causing what? Are the preferences individuals have drive them towards religious practices and preferences, or are their religious upbringing, practices, and preferences driving their political preferences? Second is the question of, well, how does this work? How does religion influence individual political behavior? And at the margins, does this make any difference in an election? And clearly here, I'm more focused on individual level than organizational, mobilization, or political interest groups. the way to pose this is to talk about it as a kind of conundrum, and I'm going to use the example of American Jewish voters as a puzzle that's yet to be really, I think, satisfactorily answered. Before I get to that, consider the fact if religion mattered, we would expect certain tests, certain simple hypotheses to hold up, that people of equal religious preference, affiliations, and practices should therefore behave in similar ways under similar conditions. They might vote the same way. They might hold policy preferences the same way. To the extent that over time these individuals are influenced by campaigns, changing political, social, and cultural mores, they may be more resistant to the changes and therefore not change in their political preferences and the influence religion has on them. How homogeneous are Catholics, born-agains, evangelicals, Jewish voters of all denominations in terms of their political preferences and voting behavior? The Jewish puzzle is a very simple one, and I suspect some of you are familiar with it, but I'll go through it very quickly. The simple fact of the matter is that every other ethnic and religious group in this country has shown certain changes over time in their voting patterns. American Jews have not. Gerald Gamm has written a very fine book on this, but the simple story simply is that since the turn of the century, since we've had good precinct or voting level data, American Jews have demonstrated an incredible consistency of liberal voting patterns for Democratic candidates and have adhered to very liberal policy positions. In fact, since we've been doing public opinion polls at any level since at least the 1956 election, Jewish voting for Democratic presidential candidates and congressional candidates has never fallen below 80%, except in 1976, when Jimmy Carter as a Democratic candidate ran, and most would attribute that in polling data to his personal faith and affirmation of his born-again Christian status, which American Jews and Democratic candidates, voters felt was crossing what we call that sort of boundary of church and state. Why? This is true of all sects of Jews, Hasidim, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, holds across region, holds across age groups, most importantly, it holds across class, holds across income levels. What is it about Jews that leads them to consistently vote for liberal Democratic candidates, or at least Democratic presidential candidates and congressional candidates? And I don't know, and most researchers don't know. I'm not here to answer the question. I'm here to pose it as a puzzle, as a way of possibly thinking about and then talking about the way we conducted some of the research I want to talk about. One never wants to study their own, and as an American Jew, I'm reluctant to give a definitive answer. Jerry Leahy's written a very fine piece that I reread, I think about 5 years ago, in which he attempts to explain this in terms of group and contextual influences, and that's my approach to the question. I think that the extent to which religion affects political behavior, independent of rival explanations, is a function of the context in which individuals practice politics and religion, and the type of group affiliation that necessarily represents. If you are a born-again Christian and you live among born-again Christians, you will be reinforced in that behavior, and what I would argue is that religion is a sort of special case of other types of group affiliations. When, however, does it influence politics? The hypothesis we had simply was that if individuals who have strong group affiliations live among those individuals or perceive themselves as living among individuals who are like themselves, then they're more comfortable exerting that influence on other forms of behavior. The question, of course, is when will religion influence politics as opposed to consumptive behavior of automobiles, socks, shoes, and hairstyles? You don't ask the question, how does religion affect your consumption of goods and services? We somehow think that religion stops at the door of politics, and it's quite reasonable to suggest that maybe religion has other influences. Alcohol consumption, social behavior, adherence to certain types of strict requirements on viewing certain types of movies and other types of cultural events. But I'm interested in is politics, so I wanted to ask, how would I study the influence of religion on politics? Well, politics occurs not in a vacuum. It occurs in situations which are dynamic. And if candidates are running for public office and they're appealing, as Clyde and John talked to certain groups, and what we want to do is look at where those campaigns are most active, where the candidates are spending a disproportionate amount of resources on persuading voters. And the simple fact of the matter is, and it's not a criticism of John's study or any others, we often sort of look for political influences in all the wrong places. We look for it where there isn't much debate. Studying the presidential campaign in Texas didn't make a whole lot of sense. There just wasn't much going on here. We were in the grandstands watching it as our governor was running and winning the presidential election. There were key states in this country, battleground states, where the candidates were spending a disproportionate amount of time and money and resources. That seemed to be a reasonable place to study the influence of campaigns on religious affiliation and how religion might influence voting behavior. So we chose to study 4 key battleground states. We added Florida as an afterthought, and it was a good afterthought. But it turns out we looked at New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Michigan. Of those 4 states, something like 29% of all dollars, time, and other resources of the 2 presidential candidates were put into those 4 states. There's still 46 other states, and it gives you some idea. One only has to be a casual observer to see how many times both candidates were stomping through Florida, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Michigan. We chose those states. We did interviews with about 1,200 voters in all 4 of those states. Later on, we supplemented with some work from our colleagues in Florida State. We looked at a wide range of voters, but we are focusing right here tonight on evangelicals. I don't want to go into the long, detailed methodology here. John and Clyde can probably tell you the difficulty of identifying a born-again, but suffice it to say, as I think John's pointed out, there's a danger in not segregating out, and I use that word cautiously, evangelicals or African-American from whites. And my concern here is white evangelicals, Catholic, Protestant, and of other Christian denominations. African-American, as I think you've seen already, evangelicals are not likely to be a player in the Republican Party. And here's the question. If, in fact, the stereotype view of a Christian right is that these are obdurate, stubborn, impenetrable voters, then we would expect over time during a campaign, these voters would be most resistant to the messages of the 2 candidates. They would start on the right, and they would be supporters of George W. Bush, and they would be intractable, unlikely to move, and not open to hearing the campaign messages. Their non-evangelical counterparts would be moving around. I won't go through all the tables. I apologize for not handing them out. But what's stunning here, and maybe the best one, is that at the beginning of the campaign, when we interviewed voters right after Labor Day, we interviewed them again in late October, just before the election, and coincidentally, and it is coincidentally, we are interviewing them again tonight. We would have interviewed them on Election Day, but we didn't know when that election was going to end, and consequently, we decided to hold after the inauguration. So we're now back in the field interviewing these 1,200 or so voters. What's interesting is that, not surprisingly, there was a 10-point gap between evangelical white and non-evangelical white voters, and the 10-point gap favored George W. Bush. At the beginning of the election, almost 40% of the evangelical and white voters, 41.1 were supporting George W. Bush, and about 31% of the non-evangelical white voters were supporting Gore. What's stunning is there was a 5-point drop among evangelical white voters. Yes, Bush won them, and won them at about a 54, 55%. But when you move the undecideds, there was a significant amount of movement among evangelical white voters in these 4 states. And the movement wasn't necessarily all towards George W. Bush from the undecided, and there were a considerable 3% defection to Gore. These are not voters, and I can go at length here because I was looking at John's paper, that are altogether different than Southern evangelical whites. The more stunning result is on virtually every public policy issue but 2, and the 2 might surprise you, obviously abortion is one, but on virtually every issue, the death penalty, Social Security, prescription drugs for the elderly, privatization of Social Security, gun control, evangelical whites and non-evangelical whites were indifferent between each other on these issues. You couldn't tell them apart. Yes, evangelical whites in these 4 states were more likely to be conservative and more likely to be Republican, but the interesting point is on the issue positions, you didn't see big movement. You didn't see big differences, and you didn't see any movement at all. They started in these positions that were about indistinguishable, and throughout the course of the campaign, they stayed about the same. I might note here, if you're not familiar with it, all 4 of these battleground states where Gore and Bush slugged it out and fought hard were won by Albert Gore. Michigan, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. And we can debate the issue of Florida at a later date. I don't know who won that state. What then is the question is, if these evangelical whites are indistinguishable on key policy issues, and I note that these are the issues that the candidates debated, school choice is in here too. Both evangelical whites and non-evangelical whites support school choice by a bare majority in all 4 of our states, but they're indistinguishable. Now, that is an issue on which, if you're familiar with the Michigan campaign, there was an actual ballot referendum, and it was a ballot referendum to allow vouchers not just in all public and private schools, but particularly in religious schools in the state of Michigan. And again, evangelicals are indistinguishable on this issue. The question is why, and to what extent might religion, for evangelicals at least, be influential? And I'll go through this quickly, because I can probably speak quicker than you might be able to listen. But the story is a simple one. The question is, when will religion matter? The hypothesis is a simple one. It's when your religious faith is reinforced in an environment in which you believe there are other people like you around you who share those values. The problem is here, and for social scientists, and I'm not certain you're all that interested in this, how do I know that people choose to live in an environment, they select into an environment like their own, and how often do they find themselves being influenced by their preferences in environments they didn't get to choose, they were forced to live in because of economic or social circumstances? What you really would like to know is to what extent are religious influences in your community influential, independent of your choices? Obviously, you could ask people or measure the number of Baptists, Catholics, Jews, Muslims that live in your neighborhood. You could talk and ask for self-reported attendance at churches. What you want is a measure that's independent. What we do here is we ask people not only about their religious affiliation, but we ask them a very simple question. Tell me about your neighbors. Are they like you? Are they not like you? Tell me about the people in your neighborhood. Are they mostly Democratic or mostly Republican? And we go through a battery of these questions. We also do something that is a bit exotic. We have a stopwatch on their answers. This is all done on the computer. And the simple story here is how quickly somebody answers that question. Doesn't matter what they're telling us, whether they're like them or not, mostly Democratic in the neighborhood. How quickly they answer that question tells us how accessible, how influential that trait of their neighborhood is to them. It turns out that's a very good predictor of how well religion, for religiously oriented individuals, will influence their behavior. And in fact, what we find is that evangelicals who live in neighborhoods with people like themselves, self-identified, and the measurement's not the answer, yes, they're like me, no, they're not like me, but the speed of that answer in milliseconds tells us a lot about how connected they are to their community and their neighbors. And that's what seems to turn on their religious affiliation. That's what gives us an incredibly strong prediction for evangelicals on voting and voting for a particular candidate. The short message here, I guess I'm saying in a somewhat arcane way, is that when does religion matter? When does any group affiliation matter? It matters when the individual finds that type of preference in their community and sees it as relevant enough for them to identify it as important in their lives. That's when it turns on. Not for many people, I might add. Most of the people who were evangelical in our survey, and we asked that question at 2 different points in time, just to see if it wasn't the influence of media coverage, Pat Robertson, a particular TV or radio ad, and we'll be asking it again as we interview throughout the week. About 15 to 20% of the voters found that this religious influence and their community mattered to them. At the margins, it probably matters, at the margins. My sense is that religion in American politics, in terms of influencing voter behavior, is very marginal. Ted Jelen, a colleague of both Clyde and John, has made this point. When does it matter then? In really close elections. And if you think about where religious right groups are likely to mobilize their voters and be most influential, in the lowest voter turnout elections. And when is that mobilization most likely to matter? In communities which have a concentration of other evangelicals, other religiously minded people. Context matters, where you live matters. My suspicions are that religion in American politics isn't all that much different than other types of group affiliation. And one of the reasons that we are preoccupied with it, other than other group affiliations, is, as I think 2 speakers before me point out, ministers are much more influential in influencing elites and making them think about politics than they actually do influence individual voter behavior. I'll stop there and hand it over to Bill.
I plan to take about the same amount of time and say 75% as much. Until quite recently, Muslims in the United States have shown very little interest in organizing themselves to wield political influence. And that has changed as thoughtful leaders have recognized that strategic mobilization of approximately 6.7 million co-religionists might enable them to speak with a louder voice. In 1997, the 4 largest Islamic groups, the American Muslim Alliance, the American Muslim Council, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is known as CAIR, which I'll refer to several times later. These joined together to form the American Muslim Political Coordination Council to provide consistent advice to Muslims about political issues and candidates, and, quote, to bring Muslims off the political sidelines and onto the political playing field. Well, the Muslim population in America is approximately equal to that of Jews, about 3% of the total population, and it's growing rapidly as a result of immigration, which the Jewish population is not growing that rapidly. That's a long way from a majority, to be sure, but as both Jews and Christian conservatives have shown, well-organized minority constituencies can wield power well out of proportion to their numbers. Now, while conceding that Muslims may never equal the power of Jews in the U.S. system, they think it's reasonable to hope that they might eventually be able to provide some kind of effective counterbalance. Now, as I mentioned, most estimates of the Muslim population in America settle at about 6.7 million. A poll conducted last summer by John Zogby, who's a highly respected pollster, found that more than 62% of Muslims over 18 were registered voters, and that 70% of those who were eligible to vote and were in the United States in 1996 actually voted. That 92% indicated they intended to vote in 2000. Now, aware that both Jews and conservative Christians increased their leverage by their commitment to voting, Muslim leaders began to think not only about increasing the percentage of Muslims who vote, but also about casting their vote as a bloc. Now, as Clyde mentioned, that's somewhat unusual, and it was certainly a new tack for Muslims. The Zogby poll taken last summer found that 58% of Muslims had voted for Bill Clinton in 1996. A poll of probable Muslim voters taken in December '99 indicated that only 25% favored Bush, with Gore and Bradley splitting evenly the 30% who planned to vote Democratic. In June 2000, with Bradley out, Gore was outpointing Bush 33% to 28%. At about the same time, a CAIR survey of Muslim voters in 37 states indicated that 43% were either undecided or felt that neither party was particularly concerned about their primary interests. In the Zogby poll, 46% identified themselves as Democrats, 16% as Republicans, 26% as independents. Ralph Nader was also drawing considerable support, not only because he was critical of Israel's use of force against the Palestinians, but also because he is Lebanese and was the first Arab American to run for president. Now, if those numbers are hard for you to keep in mind, just remember this. The important thing is, in none of these polls was George Bush leading. Now, in preparation for the spring primaries, the Coordination Council organized a massive campaign to register voters in mosques and Islamic centers, on college campuses, and at Muslim community events. They followed that up with workshops for campaign volunteers, and they invited candidates to address Muslim gatherings in major cities. Muslims saw Gore as, like Clinton, highly sympathetic to Israel, but they also tended to favor many of his domestic proposals. Now, over the course of the summer, however, they began to lean toward Bush. Now, while Gore's selection of Joe Lieberman as his running mate elated Jews and greatly pleased many others, it clearly cost Gore the votes of many Muslim Democrats who one referred to Lieberman as the senator from the Likud. The next crucial event was a gathering of more than 10,000 Muslims in Chicago over Labor Day weekend. At that meeting, the Coordination Council's proposal to encourage a block vote for one or the other of the two leading candidates got an overwhelmingly positive response. But which candidate would get that vote was still uncertain. A poll taken after the Labor Day event showed that 40% of Arab and Muslim voters were leaning toward Bush, with Nader and Gore each registering support from approximately 25% of those voters. The coalition invited each of the major candidates to meet with Muslim leaders to see where they stood on issues that Muslims deemed important. To his credit and to his benefit, George Bush accepted the invitation and met with Arab and Muslim leaders in Dearborn, Michigan on October the 5th, at which time he promised the Coordination Council that he would remain open to their concerns and their constituencies. No presidential candidate had ever done that. Less than a week later, on October 11th, in the second televised debate, Bush warmed the hearts of Arab Americans by decrying the profiling of Arabs at American airports and the use of secret evidence to detain and deport Arabs who were suspected of terrorism. Gore also agreed to meet with Muslim leaders on October 13th, but he canceled the meeting on the grounds that he had to return to Washington to discuss the heightened conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. It was plausible, and perhaps it was entirely true. It was also a crucial mistake. Gore might have been able to stem the tide that was building against him, but despite last-minute pleas from his campaign to give the vice president another opportunity, on October 23rd at the National Press Club, the coalition announced its endorsement of George Bush, just with the election 2 weeks away approximately. As word of this endorsement spread through emails, sermons, notices in mosques, and Islamic centers over the closing weeks of the campaign, Muslim support tumbled heavily for Bush. And for many, the decision was less a matter of real enthusiasm for the governor than it was a decision to cast their vote with what they spoke of as the lesser of two evils. Some still felt a fondness for Nader, but they were urged not to let sentiment overcome practicality. One activist warned that we must not express our frustrations with American politics by wasting our precious votes, which have never been needed more. On November 7, Muslim Americans voted overwhelmingly for George W. Bush. Of approximately 4.7 million eligible voters, it appears that approximately 3.2 million are thought to have actually voted. An exit poll of 1,774 Muslims, conducted by CARE, indicated that 72% voted for Bush, 19% for Nader, and only 8% for Gore, 1/3 of the support he had in September. In actual numbers, that would mean, if these are reliable, and there's some question about that, it would mean that 2.3 million voted for Bush, 256,000 for Gore, a national difference of more than 2 million. Strikingly, 36% of those said they were first-time voters. Now, interestingly, Michigan and California to a lesser extent, but two states in which Muslims thought they might make a decisive difference, along with Pennsylvania and Illinois, went for Gore. But they apparently did make a difference in Florida, which has 60,000 eligible Muslim voters. An exit survey conducted by the American Muslim Alliance indicated that Bush got slightly more than 90% of Muslim votes in the Sunshine State. Now, it should be noted that both these surveys were conducted by distributing questionnaires over the internet at mosques, Islamic centers, other community gathering places. As all of the gentlemen on this panel know, that falls considerably short of standard scientific survey research methods. On the other hand, because of the tremendously increased interest in the election and because that interest was fostered at these same locations, these findings should probably be regarded with considerable caution rather than simply dismissed. A more reliable poll conducted by John Zogby gave Bush a margin of 45% to Gore 38% among Arab Americans, only 22% of whom are Muslim. This represented a shift among Arab Americans of 28% from the 1996 Clinton-Dole election. This Zogby poll also showed that Muslims, Egyptians, and Palestinians were more likely to swing to Bush than were other Arabs. So even among non-Muslim Arabs who were not committed to a bloc vote, Bush did well, and Muslims were more likely to vote for him. Using CNN poll exit data, it appears that approximately 375,000 Florida voters identified themselves as religious but not Christian or Jewish. Several surveys indicate that at least 2/3 of 60,000 eligible Muslim voters went to the polls. That would be 40,000. It's certainly plausible that a politically energized Muslim population could account for 1/9 of all the non-Judeo-Christian religious voters. It could well have been considerably higher than that. All of the surveys conducted by Muslim organizations indicate that Gore got no more than 10% of the Muslim vote. The American Muslim Alliance Florida survey, as I indicated, gave him 8%. Now again, that's plausible, probably low. The poll gave Bush 90% compared to about 70 to 80% nationwide, with the remainder going to Nader. But even if we take the lower figure, let's say 70%, that gives Bush 28,000 votes compared to Gore's 4,000. Give Gore twice that many, you still have a gap of 20,000 votes. We know how close it was in Florida. Had Al Gore gotten 58% of those 40,000 votes, as Bill Clinton did in 1996, or even the quarter of them that it seemed that he had sewed up in September, he would be our president today. 90% of Florida's Jewish voters cast their ballots for Gore. The rest, as you know, voted for Buchanan. The dream of American Muslims is to organize themselves into an effective counterweight to Jewish voters in numbers, if not in influence and expertise. That appears to have become a reality. Whether they will remain in the Republican camp is another story. Many of them bit their tongues when they agreed to endorse Bush. Even some Muslim Republicans were less than elated. Khalid Safari, the executive director of the Islamic Institute, which is a conservative Washington-based organization designed to win Muslims to the Republican Party, said it came too fast. Bush says a few things Muslims want to hear, and boom, he gets the endorsement. They should have held out for more. Ishan Bagbi of CARE agreed. Really, he said, they just wanted to endorse someone. In truth, as far as I'm concerned, both Bush and Gore are slim pickings for Muslim, but it came down to political education. Politics 101 dictated that the community unite behind a candidate so we can show we can deliver votes. That's what it takes to gain a seat at the table. Is it an imperfect system? Yes, but it's the system that exists, and Muslims want to be players. Not too long ago, the Archbishop of Chicago, Cardinal George, said Islam is now a public religion in the United States. I think it's safe to say that Muslims are also now a public political force that should and will be taken seriously. Thank you. Well, first of all, can you hear this all right? Okay. Let me thank the members of our panel. And do you all have questions, some questions for each other here before we have questions from the audience? I'd like to ask one thing, John. Why do you think it is that more observant religious people are more likely to be Republican? Why would it not be a religious left, a Christian left?
Well, in fact, there is a Christian left, and if one uses other measures than in combination with church attendance, one can in fact define highly observant members of all religious traditions who are in fact very liberal in their theology, not necessarily in their politics, but in their theology, and that oftentimes leads to more democratic voting and more liberal positions on issues. So in a sense, this observant, non-observant measure is a very crude one. But I think but having said that, I think there are reasons why, on balance, more observant individuals in white Christian denominations tend to be more conservative. One reason is because regular worship attendance is more of a marker of traditional religiosity, and it's closely associated with traditional theological positions, traditional devotional behavior, and really it's religious traditionalists in the white denominations that have the more conservative values. And we tap that in a crude way by looking at church attendance. But if we had more sophisticated measures, we'd find even stronger relationships by being able to separate out the pure traditionalists, if you will, from individuals who may be regular church attenders but have more modernist or less traditional views. Now, the denominational context matters a great deal. It seems to be the case that more observant individuals in every religious tradition are much more likely to partake of the values of that tradition, whatever those values may be. And so, for instance, highly observant members of black Protestant churches tend to partake more of the core values of that tradition, which in political terms makes them ferociously democratic and very, very liberal. So that this mechanism doesn't always push people in a conservative direction. In fact, there are many contexts in which it pushes them in a more liberal direction. But it's just that in the large white Christian denominations, religious observance is connected with conservatism. Also, people who are, there are short-term political effects. People who are in church on Sunday regularly are just a lot easier to find and mobilize. And so we see a sort of reinforcing of those tendencies.
I think that is true, that there is no other body of people who meet together that regularly.
Could I make just a few quick comments? Bill, as usual, I found the reports from others very illuminating, and just raise one or two small exceptions. I would say also on John's point that religious people in general in this country feel that religion is under attack, which drives them in a conservative direction. Some religious groups, for historic reasons, and others depart from that norm. I think that Clyde's remark about the religious right, the evangelicals giving Bush the nomination, that like all of us, we overstate at times. I think it's true that they gave him the South Carolina primary, and in that sense, he would probably not have gone on if he hadn't won that. But beyond that, I think the Republican governors and their organizations, and there's still formidable Republican organizations in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, in the primaries in New York, Michigan, and Illinois, were very influential in putting Bush across the line. I think that you're quite possibly right that this was a critical election for the religious right. And I'd go further. It may turn out to be a critical election for the United States, which seems paradoxical in terms of such a close election. But if the economy should recover, which is a huge if, I think that the potential is there with strong support from the religious right. But for Bush to build up, contrary to the expectation of many that he'll be easily defeated in 4 years, that he may easily build up a substantial and enduring majority. Finally, with regard to Jewish voters, I think that Bob Stein's tests are certainly interesting, but you're just hearing very little of them. I think that they seem to neglect the substance of politics. I think that the Jewish voters remain liberal and democratic, and now for me to oversimplify, very largely because of fear of the religious right, to put it flatly. Jews were moving toward the Republicans actually in the 80s. Ronald Reagan got almost as many Jewish votes as Jimmy Carter did. Jimmy Carter got a minority of the Jewish vote. John Anderson, they each got about 40. Carter did a little better. John Anderson got about 20%. But I think with the emergence of the religious right in the 80s, that persuaded most Jews. And the level is still beneath what it was. It's 80% is quite high, but it's not quite as high as it was. But that persuaded most Jewish voters to stick together in what they regard as the party most likely to protect them from the religious right.
I was going to ask Clyde one question. You mentioned briefly about James Dobson, who would have seemed to have been a bigger player than he was. James Dobson, if you may or may not know, is the head director and the founder of Focus on the Family in Colorado Springs, which is sort of the anchor store for about 100 evangelical organizations in Colorado Springs, and has a radio program that's heard by many, many people. It's on right now. And you can go out and listen to it right now, I'm sure, on your car. He seems to have been very quiet in this period. What do you think Dobson's role is now and will be?
Well, organizationally, the Focus on the Family is a really big group, and boy, do they have a lot of listeners. I think that in this particular election, his silence was pretty critical for the Bush campaign to gather the momentum it did. Essentially, he's the purist, and he would be saying, boy, we can't live with this. This isn't enough for us. And he didn't say that. I was really struck just how he didn't do anything really much for Bauer early on. I mean, it struck me that just said volumes for what was going on this time, but I don't quite know why he didn't. John, do you have any thought about that? Or? I mean, you would have thought at least, some positive words and some support somewhere down the line. I don't know whether they had a falling out or what.
I've been told there was some strain between them, but I'm not sure what it was. Maybe that Bauer felt strained because he wasn't saying enough.
Yeah.
They're such individualistic people.
They are.
They're built around charismatic individuals.
Yes, right.
Charismatic individuals tend to fall out fairly easily.
Yeah.
And I don't think Dobson wanted Bauer to become more
Yeah.
prominent, but I'm not sure how much that played.
I have a question for you, Bill.
Sure.
What about Muslim money? Did they try to organize financially as well as in the voting?
They did, yes, there was, they were funneling money to themselves. I don't have any evidence of the huge sums, except they say considerable amounts of money went into it. They were trying to be much more coordinated and cooperative and focused in their work. And most of what I have on that comes from their own publications, which is, sometimes some of the numbers were far overblown, and I'm still trying to track down a little more carefully some of these things, but I was trying to give you what I think are, at least, as I say, dealt with caution, but not completely dismissed. We have microphones in the audience. Here's a gentleman here, if you'll come up about 3/4 of the way on the aisle.
I want to know, why did Gore choose Lieberman if they were going to get the Jewish votes anyhow?
Well, I think that they felt that Lieberman provided. He made it kosher to vote Democratic for Protestants, for people who were critical of Clinton. That because Lieberman had been critical of Clinton, even though it would not get for him any new Jewish votes, it did serve to indicate that Al Gore was trying to set a different kind of tone than Clinton, and it would be a different kind of White House. Does that strike you?
I would say, too, that Lieberman had appeared to be and had a reputation for being a moderate on issues like affirmative action and privatization of social security,
Faith-based
and vouchers, and all of which positions he immediately abandoned once he was put on the ticket. The one thing he stuck with was his open attitude toward religion, and I think that was probably part of it too. And I think that he actually. The polls indicated that Cheney ultimately brought Bush more votes than Lieberman brought Gore, and so it may have been a bad choice.
Maybe the other way to think about it is when Ronald Reagan picked George Bush Sr. to be his vice president, I think it had the same. This is the man that accused Ronald Reagan of voodoo economics. We forget how quickly that George W. Bush actually was pro-choice. He switched, along with many Republicans in the House and Senate, at about that time, if you want to look at a realigning election, to being pro-life. So I think, to a large extent, I think it's exactly what James said. You balance, and I think in American politics, it's like all politics is local. You look for the balance, and Lieberman was a great balancing act. Whether he brought more votes than Cheney, I think, is a tough one, but I think it probably put Gore, actually, ironically, it made Florida, I think, much more a competitive state than anyone had thought it would have been.
I think that's true.
Okay.
I'd like to ask you a question about geography and population, which may or may not have religious relations. When I was growing up, the population center of the United States was New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and Michigan, and California. And those are that's 1950. And those are the states that went for Gore. And it was an amazing thing for me to look at. That was the main population of the United States in those days. Do you have any comments on that?
I mean, all you have to do is look at the redistricting map. If you're familiar with the reallocation of all of the states you mentioned, including Wisconsin and Indiana, have lost congressional representation. Demography is more important than the epicenter, because the simple fact of the matter is, although I think James is right when he was commenting before, if you look at a map of the United States and you see this great, two ends of a tail, but if you were to look at a map of the United States and the states were sized by their population and their demographic change, what you would see is not only the movement towards the south and southwest, but something else happening. Texas, which we thought by 2020 would be a majority non-white state, maybe a non-majority white state by 2010. So the other growing population is not just African Americans, which is frankly not growing, but Hispanics. So that to a large extent, the woe for the Democrats, which I think James got a very good point here. Anybody that would, for instance, say that George Bush by 2004 is in trouble, I mean, he may very well, with a good economy, be a very strong candidate. But congressional candidates who are redistricting are getting very worried about the Hispanic vote. So it's not just the epicenter of population, that's true, but the key one is the demographic. The fastest growing population in this country are Hispanics, Mexican Americans. Their rate of registration, if you believe some of the Southwest voter, is up dramatically. The better way to put it is they couldn't go any lower, and their rates of registration have been historically low. One of the things I've done work on is early voting, this early mailing, and we have in Portland, in Oregon, and we have in Texas. Hispanics are taking advantage of that disproportionately. My guess is the battleground, and I think Karl Rove said this some weeks ago in a C-SPAN early morning, 2 a.m. Conference I watched, shows you my pitiful life, was that it was at an RNC debate about, or meeting about redistricting, we got to follow the Hispanic vote. And I think it was John who pointed out, maybe it was Clyde, that he got about 38%, 38% of the Hispanic vote, George W. Bush. He actually did better in Texas in his '94 election. Republicans are counting on that vote because that's where family values, school vouchers, school choice, those are good issues. My sense is demography is very important, more so than the epicenter.
I'd just like to add something to that. We do have this movement of people out of the old Northeast into the and Midwest into the South and the Southwest and the West Coast. I think that's really very important. But part of it is who moves. A lot of people looked at the census figures when they came out a little bit just a few weeks ago and said, "Oh boy, Bush is a shoo-in for re-election because look at all these electoral votes that are moving into the Sun Belt." And that could be true. If he were to win all of the states he won before, he would end up with more votes. But the people moving into those states might not necessarily be Bush voters. And they certainly wouldn't necessarily be like the resident population. So it's not just how people move, but it's the particular kind of people that move and can create really different kinds of politics.
I think a great many of those who move are at least potentially Republican votes. Colorado, for instance, a large part of the West. A lot of those people are coming out of California because they want to escape the roughly Democratic liberal regime. It made Colorado more Republican than it was, and I think that's happening in a lot of those states. I think one of the keys is Florida. Although Republicans can easily carry Pennsylvania and Ohio, and they did carry Ohio and carry Michigan in future elections. But if they lose Florida, then it becomes difficult. The whole Republican strategy was based on the assumption that Florida and Texas would be pillars of the Republican Party, and each, because of the growing Hispanic vote, could turn against them.
This one here. Oh, there's several hands over here.
Have any of you collected any data or have colleagues collecting data overseas that would indicate that the religious impact on elections in other democratic countries is also gaining more strength and give some credence to the concept that religious institutions are going to become increasingly important internationally?
It's becoming less so, actually, in Europe at least. That may very well not be true in Asia, and I don't know about Africa. But in Europe, the traditional religious parties are moving away from their religious attachments. The Christian democratic parties, which were closely allied with the Catholic Church in many countries, are moving away from those ties. And some of the others may have more concrete data, but I think the general sense is that religion is playing a decreasing role in the politics of Europe. So I think, although there is a sort of a shared sense of religion being under fire, I notice in Muslim groups that come to this country that I speak to, a lot of them have the sense, that we religious people, and they say monotheists often, should stick together. So I think there is some sort of pan-religious view.
There's also in Africa and Latin America, a great deal of the mission work that goes on there is done by American Pentecostals. And the American Pentecostals often strike a deal with an alliance with the government leaders in return for their letting them put their programs on state television and state radio programs. They align themselves and pump with the local organization and with the political organization, and often as a reward they show the president or the governor comes to church. They show him on their Sunday morning program, so he is seen as a pious person, and they get to stay on the television. And so there is this affirmation of whatever the status quo is, which might take different kinds of forms, but a lot of it is, a lot of these churches in Africa and South America look a lot like Pentecostal churches in Oklahoma. And in terms of the worship styles, the actual songs that they sing, these things, and it may well be that the politics will follow along with that.
Yeah, one other country is India, where the Hindu Nationalist Party essentially, has won the elections, and that's a real change for India.
So, question back here.
The numbers are quite striking in terms of the difference between the voters for Bush and Gore among observant evangelical Protestants and observant black Protestants. The dichotomy is amazing. Does somebody want to tackle the reasons for that marked difference?
Well, I guess I should, since that was the source of the numbers. Well, part of it, of course, has to do with race. And race and religion, of course, are very, very closely related. It's hard to talk about one without talking about the other in the context of American Protestantism. But that's one of the oldest divides in American politics between whites and blacks. And of course, because of our history of slavery and segregation, those lines were particularly strongly drawn among evangelicals. Most black Protestant churches actually originated as missionary work by white evangelical churches in a previous era. So part of it is race. But I think it's also the content of the messages, to pick up on an excellent point that Bob made in his presentation. It's the content of the messages that members of those churches hear and how they're connected to politics. Both groups of individuals are, generally speaking, deeply embedded in communities. There are communities that sometimes are geographic, but more often less geographic than, well, religious. They identify with members of these larger religious groups. And these individuals receive messages that are very consistent politically. And those tend to, in the context of current politics, push white evangelicals in the direction of the Republican Party and black Protestants in the direction of the Democratic Party. That relationship for white evangelicals is a relatively recent vintage, much more recent than among black Protestants. So, I mean, I think they're really good reasons, and they have to do with race and religion. These are very distinct communities that receive very distinct messages with regard to politics.
Your point about it being relatively recent, I think, is quite important in that a lot of this was not just accidental. It's important to recognize that people like Paul Weyrich and others made a conscious effort beginning in about 1979, deciding earlier. In 1976, after Jimmy Carter was elected and a lot of evangelicals came out of the pews who hadn't previously had much effect, you saw that there is that several conservative new right operatives said that evangelical Christians represent the largest stand of uncut virgin timber on the political landscape, and they set out to do some heavy logging. And Paul Weyrich, among others, Howard Phillips, and others, went to Jerry Falwell, saying, here's a person who who's in 95% of the markets in this country, and we will enlist one or more of these people and to try to get them involved in politics. Paul Weyrich has said that this alliance between conservative religions and politics didn't happen accidentally. I've been working on this for more than a decade. Paul Weyrich, incidentally, will be at our next program on Thursday night, 1 month from tonight, March the 4th, to discussing the appropriate role of politics. Along with him will be Tony Campolo, who is a stem-winding evangelical speaker and has been one of the spiritual counselors to President Clinton. And also with him will be the Reverend Barry Lynn, who is the president of Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, and is on almost every night on the television these nights. We will continue that discussion on April the 3rd, which I think is a Tuesday night, on faith-based organizations, and Marvin Olasky will be one of the speakers. Along with him will be the Reverend Eugene Rivers, who is one of the most dynamic practitioners of a faith-based organization, and we are there will be one or two players to be named later. I want to thank all of our panelists for a wonderful job. Thank Mr. Chauvin again. Thank all of you for coming, and invite you back for the other lectures in this series.
You're 26. I did that now. I did the NES. I pulled out the PSS. Very good.